Welcome to Infidelity Diaries. Explore the secrets and stories of infidelity with us. Is 5 years a lot or a little for a marriage? Time is a strange thing. It can fly by in an instant or stretch out like an eternity. When I look at Jackson, it feels like we've been together for a lifetime. Sometimes it feels like someone else's life, as if I'm observing us from a distance, through a foggy window. There's nothing truly wrong in our relationship, and that makes it even harder. If there were fights, betrayals, loud arguments, it would be easier to explain why I feel this emptiness. But there's none of that. Just the quiet, unnoticed disappearance of something important, something that maybe we never really had. Our home is a reflection of us. Everything is perfectly placed. Books on the shelves, cups in the kitchen, our movements. Even Jackson, the man I once loved with all my heart, now seems like part of this perfect order. He's always busy, always in a rush, always thinking about work, new projects. It feels like I'm just another task for him, checked off the list, not to be forgotten, but not requiring much attention. And then there's his father, Henry. To be honest, I've never quite known how to feel about him. Henry has always been reserved, quiet, but his presence is palpable. It's as if even the air around him thickens. His gaze carries a weight, a power that both attracts and repels me. You can't be indifferent around him. I often found myself aware of his attention, even when he was simply sitting in the next room. "Sarah, what do you think about spending the summer at my father's place?" Jackson suggested one evening, not lifting his eyes from his laptop. I hesitated. A summer away from the city, from this suffocating routine. Maybe that's what we need. But the thought of spending so much time with Henry felt odd. I nodded, not finding a reason to refuse. "Great idea," I replied, trying to suppress the inner unease. "Maybe it'll help us relax a little." In truth, I hoped it would give us a chance to restore something between us, something I had long since lost. But deep down, I already knew that my agreement wasn't just about saving our marriage. There was something about the suggestion that stirred a strange excitement in me, like standing at the edge of a cliff, unable to resist the urge to peer over. The road to Henry's house wound through quiet coastal roads. His house stood almost at the edge of a cliff, overlooking the vast ocean. I've always loved places like this, where nature feels powerful, almost alive. When we arrived, I was struck by the majestic atmosphere of the place. The house's walls were old, slightly darkened by time, but there was something grand about it. The wind sweeping in from the ocean seemed a part of the house itself, as if it had always been there, carried by the waves on the horizon. Henry met us at the entrance. His tall, stern figure stood out sharply against the sky. He looked at me, and I felt like that gaze pierced too deeply, leaving a mark inside me. I tried to look away, but couldn't. Then Jackson wrapped his arm around my shoulders, gently nudging me forward toward the house. "Sarah, it's good to see you again," Henry said, and I nodded, feeling my cheeks betray me by flushing. For some reason, his simple words felt like more than mere politeness. Inside, the house mirrored the same austerity and order as Henry himself. No unnecessary details, everything in its place. The rooms were spacious, bright, but cold. This coldness seemed a part of the atmosphere, seeping under the skin. Jackson soon buried himself in his work again, leaving me alone with my thoughts and occasional conversations with Henry. He often just sat, absorbed in his books or staring out the window, but I felt his presence even when he didn't seem to pay attention to me. It was a strange feeling, as if he were everywhere, even when he wasn't nearby. On the third day of our stay, Henry and I were left alone at breakfast. Jackson had gone for a run, and I was slowly sipping my coffee, gazing at the cold waves outside. The silence in the room suddenly felt too heavy. "How do you feel here?" Henry spoke unexpectedly, his voice almost tender. I flinched and looked at him. In that moment, I realized his eyes were watching me. It wasn't the casual glance of someone asking about your well-being. It was a gaze that scanned my soul, as if trying to understand something hidden, something I hadn't yet realized myself. Fine, I replied, feeling my heart quicken. It's quiet here. Henry nodded, a barely noticeable smile touching his lips. I knew he saw more in me than I was showing. In that moment, I understood that to him, I wasn't just his son's wife. I was something more, and that realization scared me. When Jackson returned, the tension dissipated. Everything returned to its usual rhythm: conversations, laughter, business calls. But inside, something had already started to change. It was as if a beast within me, long dormant, was beginning to stir, rising to the surface. That evening, I stepped out onto the terrace. The wind was strong, but I stood, stubbornly gazing at the sea. Henry came out to join me, stopping a few steps away, but I could feel him. He didn't say a word, but his presence spoke for him. I felt a strange weight in my chest, as if I were standing on the brink of something important, something that was about to change my life. I closed my eyes, trying to suppress this feeling, but it was too strong. Henry's house was not the cozy nest I had imagined for our getaway. There was no warmth in this place, the kind I so longed for after years of emptiness. The very atmosphere made me uneasy. Cold stone walls, spacious rooms with high ceilings, all steeped in dampness, and the relentless sound of waves outside the windows. It was as if the house itself was pushing me away, as though it knew what was about to happen. Henry was rarely far from me. He didn't follow me in a literal sense, but his presence was as inescapable as the ocean wind. It seeped into everything. Jackson, absorbed in his work, disappeared more and more into his projects each day. He would leave in the morning and return late at night, leaving me alone with thoughts that were becoming increasingly bold. Every time Jackson left, I was alone with the cold and with Henry. One day, while sitting on the terrace, I found myself unintentionally opening up to Henry about my life before Jackson. I had almost forgotten what it felt like to share my thoughts with someone who actually listened, but Henry listened. In his eyes, I saw genuine interest, as if my stories mattered more to him than they ever had to anyone else. "Were you always like this?" he asked me once, his voice quiet but heavy, like the stone walls around us. He didn't clarify what he meant, and that made me think. "Like what?" I replied, trying to suppress a slight tremor in my voice. Henry looked at me with a kind of attentiveness you rarely see in people. There was a mystery in his gaze, as if he already knew the answer to his question. "Unpredictable," he said, softening his smile, which barely touched his lips. "You strike me as a woman who always knows what she wants, but can't always get it." I was surprised at how accurately his words captured what I had been feeling for the past few years. And at that moment, something clicked inside me. It felt as though, for the first time in a long while, I had met someone who saw through me, without pretenses or superficial words. And surprisingly, he didn't judge me. Henry often spoke about his divorce. He didn't complain or grieve, but there was something painful in his words when he talked about the woman he once loved. I listened as he described the years they spent together, the same silent destruction that ultimately led to their breakup. "You know," he would say, "sometimes people don't lose each other because of mistakes, infidelity, or fights. It happens much more quietly. They simply stop seeing each other." Those words stuck in my mind like a needle. They resonated with my thoughts about Jackson, with the feelings I couldn't quite explain to myself. Isn't that exactly what happened with us? We lived together, but for a long time now, we had stopped truly seeing each other. I felt Henry's attention focusing more and more on me. It was something new, captivating. I tried to convince myself that there was nothing special about it, that it was just my imagination. But every word he said, every glance only intensified the strange tension between us. His presence affected me, like staring at a fire, dangerous, but at the same time alluring. One morning, when Jackson left again for a business meeting, Henry suggested we take a walk along the coast. At first, I didn't want to go, but something inside me urged me to agree. We walked along the shore, the wind playing with my hair, and I felt freer than I had in years. Henry walked beside me, and his silence wasn't awkward. There was something deep in it, like the quiet ocean lying before us. "How did you end up here, Sarah?" he suddenly asked, stopping and looking at me directly. "You know," I replied, trying to smile, "Jackson suggested it, and I agreed." But Henry shook his head. "That's not what I mean. I mean, how did you end up here, in life, in your relationship, in this moment? You must feel that something's wrong." His words cut through my defenses like a blade. I felt everything I had been hiding inside rise to the surface. How could I deny it when he already seemed to know? I couldn't find an answer. I simply nodded, feeling something inside me break. Each day, I allowed myself more. I let myself feel, let myself acknowledge that his attention had become important to me. I tried to convince myself that it was just an infatuation, a fleeting feeling that would disappear as suddenly as it had appeared. But it didn't. In fact, it grew stronger with each passing day, and I had less and less control over my thoughts and emotions. Henry seemed to do nothing extraordinary, but every action, every word of his, had an effect on me. His stories about the past made me reflect on my own future. We talked about divorce, about how relationships gradually break down, how you stop noticing what's important. More and more, I realized that my own feelings for Jackson had long since faded. I stayed with him out of duty, not out of love. All of this led me to start seeing Henry not just as my husband's father. I saw in him a man who could understand me like no one else. And the more I realized this, the harder it became to keep my distance. When Jackson returned home, I would put on my mask of calm and composure again. But between Henry and me, there was something invisible in the air. We didn't speak about it, didn't confess anything to each other, but every look we exchanged said more than words ever could. It felt like an invisible line, one I didn't want to cross, but that pulled me in like a magnet. I allowed myself to feel it, allowed myself to wonder what it all meant. The quiet rustling of rain outside the window had always calmed me, but tonight it had a different effect. The sound of the droplets, the way they hit the glass, it all merged into a troubling melody that seemed to beat in sync with my heart. I woke up suddenly, as if something, or someone, had roused me. In the darkness of the room, only a faint sliver of moonlight seeped through the curtains, casting barely perceptible shadows on the walls. And then I heard his footsteps. They weren't loud, more like soft, as though Henry was trying not to disturb anyone in the house, but I felt his presence even before I saw him. At first, it was just a vague feeling, a thin thread of tension stretching between us, like an invisible bridge. I sat up quietly on the bed, straining to listen as the footsteps drew closer. In the dark hallway, his silhouette seemed even more imposing, yet surprisingly, I wasn't scared. On the contrary, a strange sensation overcame me, as though all of this was inevitable. "Can't sleep either?" Henry's voice was soft, almost a whisper, but in the stillness of the night, it sounded clear. I didn't know how to respond. My heart was racing, and I felt that I should have gone back to my room, hidden from these relentless emotions. But instead, I nodded. "I'm going to make some tea. Want to join me?" His offer sounded innocent, almost casual, but I knew there was nothing simple about this night. I should have declined, said I was tired, that I wanted to sleep. But instead, I agreed. Inside me, two feelings battled, fear and an inexplicable attraction. I knew I should leave, but at the same time, something held me back. We went down to the kitchen. Henry slowly placed the kettle on the stove, while I stood by the window, watching the rain trickle down the glass, creating patterns as if the drops were trying to solve the same mystery I was. The surrounding silence was deafening. In the dim kitchen, the only sounds were the faint crackling of the stove and our breathing. I could almost feel the air thickening, filled with an invisible energy between us. I couldn't take my eyes off Henry. His movements were smooth, confident, but behind each gesture, something more was hidden. When he handed me the cup, our fingers barely touched. The touch was fleeting, but it sparked, stirring a storm of emotions inside me. I knew nothing good could come from this, but I couldn't make myself stop. Our gazes locked, and in that moment, I knew there was no turning back. His eyes held so much tension, hidden desire, an inner conflict that I had sensed since we first arrived here. And that tension passed to me. I could no longer pretend that nothing was happening. He took a step forward, just one step, but in that proximity there was something inevitable. I froze, my heart pounding in my throat. No words were needed because they would have been redundant. Our silence spoke more than any words. I felt the hot air tightening around us, the small kitchen turning into a closed-off space where there was nothing left but the two of us. I had anticipated this moment, but when his hand touched my face, it was still unexpected. His fingers were warm, strong, and at that touch, I trembled. It felt like that touch shattered all the barriers I had built over the past few weeks. When his lips touched mine, I couldn't stop. We both knew it was wrong, that it would change everything, but stopping was impossible. And then I pulled away, as if suddenly realizing. It felt like I was being snapped back into reality. A wave of fear, confusion, and shame surged in my chest, all at once. I stepped back sharply, as if that could erase what had just happened. But it didn't. "I can't," I whispered, feeling the tears welling up in my throat. My voice trembled, and I knew that with every word, I wasn't convincing him, or myself. Henry didn't say a word. He stood there, looking at me as if everything had already been decided, as if he knew this night would be a turning point, even if I wasn't ready to accept it yet. I almost ran to my room, feeling the ground slip away beneath me. Behind me trailed the memory of that moment, one that I could no longer take back. But deep down, I knew I had already crossed the line. This entire night, the footsteps in the dark, his gaze, the touch, it had all marked the beginning of the end of what once was. We were heading to the mountains to forget. Jackson was full of enthusiasm. This trip had been his idea, his way of getting away from it all. He had always been a master at planning trips, as if a perfect schedule and a change of scenery could save us from our problems. But I knew. There was no landscape that could erase that kiss from my memory. The mountains were majestic, unyielding, their snow-covered peaks towering above us like silent giants. The cool air was invigorating, but instead of clearing my thoughts, it seemed to sharpen every emotion. With each step, with each breath of fresh air, the tension between Henry and me only grew. In his gaze, which I now noticed constantly, there was something inevitable. Every accidental gesture, every detail, it was all a reminder of what had happened in the darkness, in that kitchen. Jackson acted as if nothing had happened. For him, everything was as usual. Morning runs, talks about work, discussions of evening plans. He was so absorbed in his own affairs that he didn't even notice the thin, almost invisible thread of tension that now connected Henry and me. One evening, we decided to build a fire. The dense forest surrounding us was filled with the sounds of the night, the rustling of leaves, the distant calls of birds, and the crunch of twigs underfoot. The fire crackled, and its bright flames seemed to tear through the darkness, creating the illusion of safety. Exhausted from hiking and the day's impressions, Jackson went to bed first. Henry and I stayed by the fire. I tried to avoid his gaze, tried to keep my distance, but the silence between us became unbearable. Every breath, every crackle of the fire felt too loud. Around us, the night was quiet, but inside me, a storm was raging. Henry sat next to me, too close, but in that closeness, there was something inevitable. We sat there, and every moment stretched on, as if forever. "That was a mistake," I blurted out before I could think. He didn't reply immediately. I glanced at him and met his eyes. There was no doubt in his gaze. He looked at me as though he knew I didn't believe my own words. I was trying to shield myself with those words, trying to return to the familiar boundaries where you could say, "This is a mistake," and forget everything. But his eyes said otherwise. "It's not a mistake," Henry finally said, his voice quiet but firm, like the wind that howled through the mountains. "It's something more." My lips trembled. Something inside me broke. Or maybe it had broken long ago, and I just didn't want to admit it. All my words, my attempts to defend myself, they were useless in the face of what I felt. "I can't," I whispered, feeling a lump rise in my throat. "This is wrong." Henry kept looking at me, unwavering. He wasn't judging. He wasn't pressuring. He was just there, as he always had been. His silence was more powerful than any words. There was something calming in his presence, yet it also filled me with fear. I was afraid that he saw right through me, that he knew more about me than I was ready to admit. "We can't keep doing this," I continued, but my words sounded uncertain, like I was trying to convince myself, not him. "Sarah," Henry said, his voice soft but resolute. "We both know what's happening. This isn't just a fleeting moment. It's something more. You feel it." I couldn't look him in the eyes. I knew he was right, but inside me, contradictions raged. My mind was pulling me back to the familiar, safe space where Jackson was my husband, where our relationship was normal, even if it had long since lost its warmth. But my heart said otherwise. It pulled me toward Henry, and I couldn't deny it. I took a deep breath, trying to gather my thoughts, but the mountain air was as heavy as my feelings. Every time I tried to rationalize, to tell myself that this was just a temporary infatuation, that it was wrong, my words lost their power when I was near him. "It's wrong," I repeated, but now with even less conviction. Henry stayed silent, but in his silence, I heard the answer. He wasn't trying to convince me with words. He was just there, his presence confirming what we both already knew. This was inevitable. We sat by the fire, and I felt the flames burning not only in front of us, but inside me as well. I knew that this conversation was only the beginning. The house we returned to after our trip to the mountains greeted us with its usual coldness. It felt as though the walls here still held the tension that neither the mountains, nor the fresh air, nor the landscapes Jackson had been so enthusiastic about in recent days could absorb. I listened to his stories about the routes, the climbs, the beauty of nature, but all I hear is a dull ringing in my head. His voice seems distant from me, like an echo from a faraway past. Guilt is suffocating me. I look at Jackson, and I'm torn apart. He doesn't deserve what I'm doing to him. He's still the same Jackson, my husband, the man I once promised to be faithful to support and love. But with every look, every smile, I feel that an invisible chasm has formed between us. And worst of all, he doesn't notice it. He doesn't see that I've changed, that I'm no longer who I used to be. I sit next to him in the kitchen, where our conversations have become automatic. He tells me about his plans for the next week, about upcoming meetings, but I can't focus on his words. My guilt overwhelms me like a wave, like a tide. I can't tell him. I can't even look into his eyes for too long. My thoughts constantly return to Henry, to his gaze, to that moment by the fire that shattered my last internal barriers. Henry is close again. His presence haunts me in the house, just as it did in the mountains. Every time I meet his eyes, I feel that same overwhelming inner conflict. We both know this can't go on. We tried to convince ourselves that these were just fleeting moments, that we could stop it before it went too far. But every time our paths cross, I realize it's already gone too far. Every morning when I wake up, I feel broken. I want to go back, to stop everything before I cross this line, but it's too late. And the most terrifying thing is that I can't stop myself anymore. It's like an inevitable fall. I know it will lead to my destruction, but I keep moving forward as if hypnotized. Henry no longer pretends that there's nothing between us. He no longer plays the role of the distant father of my husband. I feel it every time he's near. Our conversations are shorter now, as if words are getting in the way of something deeper between us. Our glances say everything we don't dare speak aloud. And in this silent dialogue lies the whole truth. I feel like a traitor. Every day, it gets worse. But even this fact doesn't stop me. Every time Jackson looks at me, his eyes full of trust and care. He suspects nothing. This trust, it's the heaviest burden I carry. It weighs on me, and it makes me feel even more guilty. But inside, there's another battle going on, between what I feel for Jackson and what Henry has awakened in me. One evening, when Jackson stayed late at work, Henry and I met again in the kitchen. It seemed accidental, but we both knew that accidents no longer happen. Henry was standing by the window when I entered. I didn't say a word, but he already felt my presence. "This can't go on," I said quietly, looking at his reflection in the window. My voice trembled, and I didn't even believe my own words. Henry remained silent. His gaze was as steady as a rock. He didn't say a word, but his presence spoke for him. We both knew this wouldn't end easily. I tried to convince myself that it could stop, that not everything was lost. But inside, I knew I couldn't go back. "Jackson doesn't deserve this," I whispered, trying to drown out the feelings that were overwhelming me. He sighed, finally turning to me. His eyes were full of determination, but there was no judgment. "We can't pretend these are just fleeting moments, Sarah." His voice was quiet but firm. "You know it as well as I do." I couldn't respond. All I could do was keep looking into his eyes and realizing that we were both trapped by our own emotions. It was like a web we had woven for ourselves. Every time I look at Jackson, my heart breaks. He doesn't see that I've changed, that I'm no longer who I used to be. It scares me. It terrifies me to my core because I can't stop myself. Every morning begins with anxiety. This feeling, like a dense fog, envelops me before I even open my eyes. I wake up, and my first breath is already poisoned with dread. Something inside me tightens, as if waiting for the next lie that will inevitably slip from my lips. An inner voice whispers that I can't keep going like this, but I remain silent. I stay silent and continue living. Henry has become my reflection, my inevitable companion. We can no longer stop. Our encounters, even accidental ones, are no longer brief moments of temptation. They are entire worlds we inhabit, hiding behind a thin wall of pretense. We say one thing, but our eyes scream another. I see it in his gaze every time we meet on the stairs, in the hallway, in the kitchen. The whole house has become a silent witness to our inner contradictions. Jackson is starting to notice something. Not long ago, he was so absorbed in his work that he seemed oblivious to everything around him. But now something has changed. He's asking questions. Too many questions that seem innocent, but I feel their sharpness. He doesn't say it outright, but I know. He senses something is wrong. Every time he looks at me, it becomes harder for me to breathe, as if I'm sinking deeper into a swamp of lies. I've lied so often that it has almost become a habit. The lies leave my lips with such ease, as if they were something ordinary. They flow like water, filling all the cracks in our lives. But I know this flood can no longer be stopped. The lies have woven themselves into my being, filling all the spaces that were once occupied by love and trust. I lie more often than I breathe. Every word is like poison, contaminating not only me, but everything around me. One evening, Henry and I went out to the beach. Jackson was working late, and feeling like I was on the edge, I suggested we take a walk. The night was quiet, with only a light breeze touching our faces, and the waves lazily rolling onto the shore. In the distance, the city lights shimmered, but everything seemed so far away, so unreal, as if Henry and I had ended up on the edge of another world, far from everyone else. We walked in silence for a long time, side by side. I felt him near me, his heavy, relentless presence that both comforted and destroyed me from within. "We can't keep going like this," he finally said, stopping and staring out at the endless ocean before us. His voice was quiet, as always, but it carried the weight of all the unresolved questions, all the unspoken words we had kept hidden for too long. I knew he was right. I felt it with every fiber of my being. Every time I return to Jackson, I feel the growing distance between us. That distance is becoming a part of our lives, invisible but palpable. But what was even worse, I could no longer imagine myself without Henry. That was the bitter truth I couldn't deny. Every word he spoke, every movement he made only deepened the pain I was already carrying. "I know," I whispered, feeling the wind cut through me to my bones. I watched the water, the dark waves that were born somewhere deep in the ocean and rushed toward the shore, inevitable like my own feelings. Henry stepped closer, his hand brushing my back, and I froze. His touch was both warm and heavy, like a burden I could no longer bear, but couldn't let go of either. I knew that in every gesture, in every word, there was a truth we were both afraid to admit. "You realize this is destroying us, don't you?" His voice trembled, but in his eyes, I saw the same strength I had seen from the beginning. "We can't keep living in this lie. It's tearing everything apart." I remained silent. My thoughts swirled like leaves in an autumn windstorm, tangled, contradictory. I couldn't find the answers to his questions because the answers were too painful. I knew he was right, knew that this lie, this double life we were leading, was destroying us from within. But how do you stop when you've already gone so far? "Jackson, he doesn't deserve this," I finally said, feeling my throat tighten with the tears I couldn't allow myself to shed. Henry sighed. I watched as his shoulders slumped slightly, as if the weight of his own choices pressed down on him just as much as it did on me. "No one deserves this," he replied. "But what can we do? Go back? Pretend none of this ever happened?" His words echoed in my mind. Go back. We couldn't. We had gone too far. I could no longer return to that place where everything was simple and clear. All I could do was admit that we were both lost in this, and at the same time, I couldn't let go of what was happening between us. We stood on the shore for a while longer. The wind grew stronger, and the waves seemed to increase their rhythm, just like my thoughts. We both knew we had to decide something, that this couldn't continue, but the decision felt so painful that I couldn't force myself to make it. With each passing day, I felt the walls closing in around me. Jackson was becoming more attentive, and it was getting harder for me to hide my emotions. His questions became more insistent, though they were still framed in casual terms. "Are you okay? You've changed somehow? Is something wrong?" I tried to dodge, hiding behind ordinary responses, but each morning started with a new wave of anxiety. I felt my lies beginning to unravel at the seams. The false life I had dragged both Jackson and myself into was starting to collapse. The deceit it was built upon was too fragile, too unreliable. I felt like an actress who had forgotten her lines, and the stage beneath me was crumbling, but I kept performing, hoping no one would notice. Every time Jackson looked at me, I could feel his gaze piercing deeper, trying to unravel the mystery I had created. He no longer believed my words, no longer trusted my explanations. The very thing I feared most began to awaken within him: suspicion. "You're not the same as before," he said one evening, as we were having dinner. His voice was quiet, but there was a hint of concern in it. I jolted, feeling a cold wave rush through my body. He wasn't trying to hide his thoughts. I looked at him, trying to feign surprise, but deep down I knew he was right. I had changed. We both had, but I couldn't admit it to him. "What are you talking about?" I asked, trying to keep calm. "I don't know, Sarah." His gaze was tense. "You've pulled away. You've become someone else." Those words hung in the air like poisoned arrows. They pierced me, and I felt a tremor run through my body. But I couldn't tell the truth. Too much was at stake, and any word I could say would only make the situation worse. I was trapped by my own decisions. Henry had started to notice it too. He suggested we end things, draw the line before it destroyed everyone around us. But we both knew that was impossible. Our feelings, our actions, were already tangled into a tight knot that couldn't be undone. "We can't keep going like this," he told me one evening when we were alone again. His voice was soft, almost pleading, but I knew he wasn't saying it because he wanted to stop. He said it because we could no longer live like this. But there was no belief in his words that we could change anything. I stayed silent. We both did. All I could do was look at him, feeling the internal battle I could no longer control. This was the point he had spoken of. We should stop, but we couldn't. One evening, everything became even more complicated. Jackson was home. I was sitting with him on the couch, listening to his stories about work, but my mind was far away. I barely heard him. My eyes wandered around the room until I suddenly met Henry's gaze. He stood in the doorway, and in his eyes, I saw what I had long felt: tension, the impossibility of hiding our feelings. Our eyes locked, and in that moment, I almost lost control. Something inside me broke. I felt a wave of fear wash over me, like everything I had built was collapsing before my eyes. It was like a slow-motion disaster that I couldn't stop. I could no longer pretend that nothing was happening. Jackson was saying something, but I wasn't listening. The entire room disappeared for me. All that remained was Henry and the invisible bridge we had built between us. It was the moment when all the walls I had erected around myself began to crumble. I knew that if I continued like this, we would destroy everything. I don't know how Jackson found out. Maybe he suspected from the very beginning, but chose to ignore it until every hint, every unsaid word became too obvious. He was too observant, too intuitive not to sense it. But when everything finally came to light, it wasn't an explosion, not the loud scandal I had imagined. It was silence. Deafening, cold, piercing silence that spoke louder than any screams. I sat at the table, facing Jackson, and all I could see were his eyes. They were empty, like black holes, swallowing everything around them: our past, our memories, our promises. There was no life in those eyes anymore, no love, not even anger. Just the cold realization that everything we had was destroyed. Henry sat next to me. I felt his tense presence, but even he couldn't soften this moment. When Jackson finally spoke, his voice was as quiet as the whisper of wind in an empty room. "How long?" he asked, without looking up from the table. His hands were clasped in front of him, and I saw his fingers tightening and loosening, as if he was trying to hold himself together. I didn't know what to say. The words were stuck in my throat, and my mouth felt dry, as if anything I could say would be meaningless. How long? How could I measure that time when it felt like it had been there all along? As if this moment had always been inevitable, as if we had been walking toward it this entire time. "It's not that simple," I finally forced out, but even I didn't believe my own words. Simplicity had no place here. Everything was far more complicated and deeper than I could have imagined. Jackson looked up. His eyes weren't just empty, they were icy, something that made me freeze in place. "You destroyed us," he said calmly, as if it wasn't my fault, or his, but just a fact, like the way an old building collapses under the weight of time. I felt it all along, but I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't look at him. It hurt too much to see that emptiness, that final break. We always thought we could get through anything. We were strong, confident, and even when our relationship started drifting apart, I convinced myself it was temporary. But it turned out even the strongest structure can collapse if it's left unsupported for too long. Henry, who had been silent until now, suddenly started to speak. His voice was rough, low, as if every word was painful for him. "Jackson, he began, but Jackson raised his hand sharply, cutting him off. It wasn't an aggressive gesture, more emotion that said, "Enough. Don't." Jackson said, his voice steady, but there was something threatening in it. Nothing you say will change what happened. You're my father, and you. He looked at me, and there was something like disgust flashing in his eyes. You're my wife. How could you? Those words cut through the air like a knife. I couldn't breathe. I felt the walls of the room closing in on me, every sound becoming too loud, my pulse pounding in my temples. I wanted to say something, to justify myself, to find words that could soften this moment, but there were none. All I could do was stay silent. Henry tried to explain, but his words didn't matter. The whole situation was too big to rationalize. Jackson wasn't listening, and I couldn't blame him. In that moment, I felt the full weight of my decisions. Each one was a brick I had laid in this wall of betrayal. I trusted both of you, Jackson said, his voice trembling, but he was still holding on. But this is unforgivable. I looked at him and felt everything I had once had slipping away. I had lost it all. I lost Jackson, lost our life, our home, our hopes for the future. I had destroyed it with my own hands, my own actions. And now, I had nothing left to say. Just the bitter realization that I could never get any of it back. The three of us sat at the table, and in that silence, there was more pain than in all the arguments and shouting that could have happened. Jackson's silence. This was the worst part. It was as if everything he wanted to say was too unutterable. I glanced at Henry, and in his eyes, I saw the same pain. We both knew this was the end of everything that was, and everything that could have been. We had destroyed not only our bond, but ourselves. Jackson was as cold as an icy wind. When he finally spoke his decision, his voice didn't tremble, it wasn't loud. On the contrary, it was almost quiet. Yet there was something relentless about it. Both of you, leave, he said, not looking at me or Henry. I don't want to see you anymore. Ever. These words hung in the air like a stone dropped into calm water, and the ripples were still spreading, turning into waves of destruction. Jackson no longer looked up at us. His face was frozen, as if he had already made all the possible decisions, and now his soul no longer needed any explanations. Everything had already happened. I'll file for divorce, he said, and his words sounded like a verdict, leaving no room for negotiation. Now leave. I sat across from him, feeling my heart slowly shatter into 1,000 pieces, each one piercing my chest with pain. I wanted to say something, perhaps justify myself, perhaps ask for forgiveness, but I knew that words wouldn't change anything anymore. Everything between us had already collapsed, like an old building that had been neglected for too long. Henry nodded, as if agreeing that there was no other way. He was the first to stand up and head for the door. I followed him, feeling the trail of losses stretching behind every step. There was no farewell, only silence. Cold, suffocating silence. We left together, and for a while, it felt like we could start life anew. Leaving Jackson behind, we thought we could build something of our own, something new. But by the third day, that illusion began to crumble. Every time I looked at Henry, I saw in his eyes the pain and the realization that everything between us was built on the ruins of another person's life. We had destroyed Jackson, destroyed his trust, his family, and even worse, we had destroyed ourselves. We tried to live together. Henry rented a small apartment, and at first, it felt like an escape from all the pain that haunted us. But the tension didn't disappear. It hovered above us, like a ghost, like a reminder that we couldn't be happy while building our happiness on someone else's pain. Every conversation, every touch between us became a reminder of Jackson. We tried to be together, but instead, we felt that the closer we got, the more distant we became from each other. I could see Henry withdrawing into himself, his gaze becoming more distant with each passing day. He no longer tried to hide the fact that he felt it too. We both knew this couldn't go on. And one evening, as we sat together in silence once again, Henry finally said what had long been hanging in the air. "We can't live like this, Sarah," he said quietly, but his words sounded final. "I can't. We destroyed Jackson, and we're destroying ourselves." I nodded, feeling the tears welling up in my throat. Deep down, I had known this from the very beginning. We could never build happiness on what we had destroyed. From the moment our relationship crossed that invisible line, I already knew that nothing good would come of it. We couldn't be together, knowing how much pain we had caused. "I know," I whispered, feeling my heart clench. "We can't." We didn't try to make excuses anymore. We didn't fight, didn't blame each other. Everything was crystal clear. We were both guilty. We both had lost. Henry packed his things and left that same night. I didn't try to stop him. His departure was as inevitable as the fact that I was left alone. Being alone was hard. At first, it felt like I was plunging into an abyss of loneliness. Everything that had once made up my life, family, home, relationships, had crumbled. I was no longer the woman who once believed she could control her fate. I had lost Jackson, lost Henry, and now I had lost myself. I tried to start a new life. I moved to another city, rented an apartment, got a new job, but every day reminded me that I was alone. Every moment was filled with regret over having destroyed my family, having destroyed my life. I tried to be strong, but the emptiness I had created around me became my constant companion. Sometimes I catch myself thinking I could have done things differently. I could have stopped myself. I could have saved what I had. But time can't be turned back, and now all I have left are the memories of the mistakes I made.